The evening crowd had already filled most of the tables in the small restaurant near the city square. Warm yellow lights hung from the ceiling, and the soft sound of dishes clinking mixed with quiet conversations. It was the kind of place where people came after a long day to relax, eat good food, and listen to gentle piano music that played in the background. In the corner of the room stood an old black piano. It had been there for years. Many musicians had played it before, but tonight it was silent. The usual performer had called earlier to say he would not be coming. The manager had decided that soft recorded music would be enough for the night. Guests laughed at their tables, sharing stories and enjoying their meals. Waiters moved quickly between the tables carrying plates of hot food. The smell of freshly baked bread and warm soup filled the air. Outside, however, the night felt very different. Cold wind moved through the quiet street, pushing small pieces of paper across the sidewalk. The lights from the restaurant windows glowed brightly against the darkness. A young woman slowly walked down the street. Her steps were tired and careful, as if every step required effort. Her clothes were simple and slightly worn, not dirty but clearly old. She held her hands together as she walked, trying to stay warm. Her face showed the kind of tiredness that comes after many difficult days. But her eyes were calm. They carried something deeper than exhaustion. They carried patience. She stopped for a moment in front of the restaurant window. Through the glass she could see people eating, smiling, enjoying their evening. The warm lights inside made the place look inviting. For a moment she simply stood there watching. Then her eyes moved to the corner of the room. The piano. She stared at it for several seconds. Something about it made her expression change slightly. Not sadness. Not excitement. Something quieter. Something thoughtful. She looked away and took a slow breath. Her stomach reminded her that she had not eaten properly all day. Maybe even longer than that. For a moment it seemed like she might simply turn around and continue walking down the dark street. But instead she stepped toward the door. When she opened it, a small bell above the entrance rang softly. Several people glanced toward the door for a second before returning to their conversations. New guests arrived all the time, so no one paid much attention. She stepped inside slowly. Warm air surrounded her immediately, a strong contrast to the cold outside. The smell of food made her stomach tighten again. She looked around quietly. The restaurant was almost full. Every table held people enjoying their evening. A waiter passing by noticed her standing near the door. "Welcome," he said politely. "Table for one?" The woman hesitated for a moment. Her voice was gentle when she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said. "May I speak with the manager for a moment?" The waiter looked a little confused but nodded. "Of course." He walked toward the front counter where the manager was checking a small notebook and speaking with another employee. After a short moment, the manager walked over. The manager was used to dealing with many kinds of people. Business owners learned quickly how to read situations. The moment the manager saw the young woman standing near the door, a quiet understanding appeared in their eyes. It was not judgment, just recognition. Many people came asking for help from time to time. Still, the manager walked over calmly. "Yes?" the manager said kindly. "How can I help you?" The woman looked slightly nervous but kept her voice steady. "I know this may sound strange," she said. The manager waited patiently. The guests at the nearest table had started listening without meaning to. Curiosity often traveled quickly in a quiet room. The woman glanced briefly toward the piano in the corner. Then she looked back at the manager. "May I play for a piece of food?" For a second, the manager didn't fully understand what she meant. "Play?" the manager asked. She nodded gently toward the piano. "I can play the piano," she said softly. "If I may play a song, I would only ask for something small to eat." At the nearby table, someone chuckled quietly. Another guest smiled with mild amusement. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was the kind people make when they hear something unexpected and slightly strange. One guest leaned back in the chair and whispered to a friend, "This should be interesting." The manager folded their arms and glanced toward the piano. The old instrument had not been used yet tonight. "You play?" the manager asked carefully. "Yes." "Where did you learn?" The The woman paused for a moment. "A long time ago," she said. The manager studied her face for a few seconds. There was something sincere about her expression. She did not look like someone trying to perform a trick. Still, the request was unusual. Another quiet laugh came from a table behind them. Someone said softly, "Why not let her try?" Another guest added, "It might be entertaining." The manager looked around the room. Several guests were now watching the conversation with curiosity. The manager turned back to the woman. "What if you cannot play?" the manager asked gently. The woman did not seem offended by the question. "Then I will leave quietly," she said. "And I will thank you for listening." The answer surprised the manager. There was no pride in her voice. No argument. Just honesty. The manager sighed softly. "Well," the manager said after a moment, "our pianist did not come tonight." The guests nearby leaned forward slightly. The manager looked at the piano again. "All right," the manager finally said. "One song." A few people clapped lightly, amused by the situation. The woman nodded with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." She walked slowly toward the piano. Her steps were careful, but something about her posture changed slightly as she approached the instrument. The tiredness in her movement seemed to fade just a little. Several guests turned their chairs toward the corner to watch. Some looked curious. Others still seemed amused. One man whispered jokingly, "This should be quick." The woman reached the piano bench and stood beside it for a moment. She gently touched the top of the piano as if greeting an old friend. Then she sat down. The room was not completely silent, but the level of conversation dropped noticeably. She placed her hands lightly on the keys. For a brief second she did nothing. Her eyes closed. It looked almost like she was remembering something. Across the room, the manager watched carefully. Some guests leaned closer. A few people still smiled, as if expecting a simple tune played by someone who only knew a few notes. But the woman remained still. Her fingers rested on the piano keys without pressing them. The quiet stretched for just a moment longer. Then her fingers moved. The first note filled the room. Soft, clear, and perfectly placed. A second note followed. Then another. The sound was gentle but confident, like someone speaking calmly in a quiet room. The guests who had been smiling began to notice something. This did not sound like someone guessing their way through a melody. The woman's hands moved slowly at first, then more smoothly across the keyboard. The notes began forming a melody. Conversations started fading around the room. One guest stopped halfway through lifting a glass. A waiter paused near a table. The music grew deeper, richer. The woman's fingers moved with natural ease, like someone who had spent years understanding every sound the instrument could create. Within less than a minute, the entire atmosphere of the restaurant began to change. People who had laughed earlier were no longer smiling. They were listening. The manager's expression slowly shifted from polite curiosity to quiet surprise. The melody carried emotion that filled the room gently but completely. It did not sound like a performance meant to impress. It sounded like a story, and somehow every person in the restaurant could feel it. No one laughed now. No one whispered. All eyes slowly turned toward the young woman sitting at the piano. And the music had only just begun. The first few notes floated through the restaurant so softly that at first some people thought it might simply be a simple tune. But within seconds something began to change in the room. Conversations that had filled the air only moments earlier slowly began to fade. The young woman's fingers moved gently across the piano keys, not in a rushed way, but with the calm confidence of someone who understood every sound the instrument could make. The melody grew slowly, like a quiet story beginning to unfold. A guest who had been laughing earlier leaned forward slightly in the chair. "That actually sounds good," the guest whispered to the friend sitting across the table. The friend nodded, eyes fixed on the corner where the piano stood. At another table, a waiter who had been carrying a tray stopped for a moment before continuing toward the kitchen. Even the small sounds of dishes and glasses seemed quieter now, as if the room itself was listening. The woman at the piano kept her eyes lowered toward the keys. Her face remained calm, but her hands moved with a natural grace that was impossible to ignore. The music was not loud, yet it filled every corner of the restaurant. Each note seemed to connect smoothly with the next, building a melody that felt both peaceful and powerful at the same time. The manager, who had been standing near the front counter, slowly walked closer. At first the manager simply wanted to observe, but after only a few moments, it became clear that this was no ordinary performance. The woman's playing was controlled, emotional, and incredibly precise. A couple sitting near the window quietly put down their forks. "Is she really playing for food?" the woman asked softly. Her partner shrugged, still watching the piano. "If she is, then we may be the lucky ones tonight." The music began to grow richer. The woman's left hand moved across the lower keys, creating deep tones that supported the brighter notes played by her right hand. The sound was balanced and full, like a small orchestra hidden inside the piano. Guests who had originally turned their chairs just out of curiosity were now sitting completely still. Even those who had not noticed the beginning of the performance slowly became aware that something special was happening. One guest who had just entered the restaurant paused near the door, listening. "Who's playing tonight?" the guest asked quietly. A waiter near the entrance shook his head with a small smile. "Honestly, we just met her." Back at the piano, the woman's hands began moving faster now. The melody shifted into something more energetic, almost playful. The notes danced across the keys with surprising speed. A few guests exchanged amazed glances. "How is she doing that?" someone whispered. The woman remained focused. Her shoulders stayed relaxed while her fingers moved with remarkable accuracy. It looked effortless, but anyone who understood music could see the skill behind it. The manager stepped a little closer to the piano, careful not to disturb the performance. A memory passed through the manager's mind, all the professional musicians who had played in this restaurant over the years. Many had been talented, some had been very good, but this was different. This felt personal. The music carried emotion in a way that reached people quietly. It wasn't just about technical skill. It felt like the woman was sharing something deeper through every note. At one of the tables, an older guest closed their eyes while listening. After a moment, they whispered softly, "This reminds me of something, I can't explain it." Across the room, the kitchen door opened slightly. One of the cooks leaned out, curious about the music that had suddenly changed the atmosphere of the restaurant. "What's going on out here?" the cook asked. A waiter answered in a low voice, "You should come listen." The cook stepped out quietly and stood near the wall, arms crossed, watching the young woman play. Meanwhile, the melody shifted again. The faster notes slowly softened into a slower, deeper section of the piece. The music now felt thoughtful, almost reflective, like someone remembering an important moment from the past. The woman's eyes remained focused on the keys. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed something in her expression. Not sadness, not happiness, just concentration mixed with feeling. The restaurant felt completely different now compared to earlier that evening. The laughter and casual noise had been replaced by quiet attention. People who had come only for dinner were now experiencing something unexpected. A man at a table near the piano leaned toward the manager, who was now standing only a few steps away. "Where did you find her?" he asked quietly. The manager shook their head slowly. "She found us." The man looked back at the piano with a small smile of disbelief. "Well, she should stay." The music continued flowing through the room, rising and falling like a calm wave. Some parts were gentle, while others carried sudden bursts of energy that surprised the listeners. Every time the melody changed, the guests leaned in just a little more. At the back of the restaurant, two young guests who had been busy with their phones earlier had now completely forgotten about them. "Listen to that," one of them whispered. "I know," the other replied quietly. "She's incredible." Near the entrance, another guest who had just arrived was being guided to a table. But before sitting down, they paused. "Is there a performance tonight?" they asked. The waiter smiled. "Something like that." The woman at the piano moved into another section of the music, one that required quick and precise movements. Her fingers moved faster now, gliding across the keys in a way that seemed almost effortless. A quiet gasp came from one of the tables. The skill in her playing was now impossible to ignore. Even people who knew very little about music could tell that this level of talent did not come from simple practice. It came from years of dedication. The manager folded their arms thoughtfully, watching her closely. How could someone with such ability walk into a restaurant asking for food? The question stayed in the manager's mind. At that moment, the melody softened again. The woman slowed her playing, allowing each note to linger in the air before the next one arrived. The room felt almost peaceful now. One guest whispered softly to another, "I feel like I'm listening to someone telling their life story." The friend nodded. That's exactly what it feels like. The music carried warmth, sadness, hope, and strength all at once. It moved through the room like a quiet conversation between the piano and every person listening. Some guests leaned back in their chairs, completely absorbed. Others watched her hands carefully, amazed by the control she had over every movement. The cooks in the kitchen doorway remained standing there, unwilling to miss even a moment. The waiter near the entrance had stopped checking the reservation book. Everyone was listening. The young woman did not look up from the piano once. For her, the restaurant, the guests, the lights, none of it seemed to matter. There was only the music and the piano. Her fingers moved through another graceful passage, filling the room with a gentle wave of sound. At a nearby table, the same guest who had laughed earlier slowly shook their head. "I can't believe we laughed," they murmured quietly. Across the room, the manager heard the comment but said nothing. Because the truth was, many people had laughed. But no one was laughing anymore. Now they were simply listening. And the woman at the piano was only halfway through the piece. The music continued to move gently through the restaurant, filling the quiet space with a feeling that was hard to describe. By now, every table had turned toward the piano. No one was focused on their food anymore. Plates sat half-finished, drinks rested untouched, and conversations had completely stopped. The young woman kept playing as if she were alone in the room. Her shoulders were relaxed, her posture calm, and her fingers moved across the keys with steady confidence. It was clear she was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply playing the music the way it lived inside her. The melody slowly grew deeper. Her left hand carried soft, steady notes that sounded like footsteps moving through a long journey. Above those notes, her right hand played a gentle melody that rose and fell like a quiet voice telling a story. A guest sitting near the center of the room leaned closer to the table. "This isn't normal," the guest whispered. The friend across the table nodded slowly without looking away from the piano. "I know," the friend said softly. "You don't hear this kind of playing in small restaurants." Near the kitchen door, two cooks were still standing side by side, watching carefully. One of them whispered, "She plays like someone who spent years studying." The other cook shrugged slowly. "Then why would she come here asking for food?" No one in the room knew the answer. The manager stood quietly near the piano now, arms loosely crossed. The manager had planned only to allow one short song, but something about the music made it impossible to interrupt. The performance felt important, not like entertainment, more like something personal. The young woman moved into a faster section of the piece. Her fingers began to dance across the keys with surprising speed, but the sound remained clear and controlled. Several guests exchanged looks of pure surprise. One man quietly shook his head. "How is she doing that?" he whispered. The speed of her hands was impressive, but what amazed people more was the emotion behind every note. The music did not feel mechanical or rehearsed. It felt alive. A waiter carrying a tray stopped again near one of the tables. The guest at the table smiled at the waiter and said quietly, "You might want to stay a moment." The waiter gave a small nod and remained standing there, listening. At the piano, the woman gently leaned forward as her hands moved across the keyboard. The music built into a strong and powerful melody that filled the entire room. For a brief moment it almost sounded like a storm of sound moving through the restaurant. Then suddenly, just as quickly as it had risen, the music softened again. The change was so smooth that several people let out quiet breaths they didn't even realize they had been holding. An older guest near the window wiped their eyes gently. The person sitting beside them noticed. "Are you all right?" they asked softly. "Yes," the older guest replied with a small smile. "It's just beautiful." The music now sounded calmer, like a peaceful evening after a long day. Each note seemed to float through the air before fading away. The woman's fingers slowed down slightly, moving with delicate care across the keys. At one of the tables closer to the piano, a guest leaned toward the manager. "You should hire her," the guest whispered. The manager gave a small thoughtful nod but said nothing yet. It was too early to interrupt. Across the room, a couple who had just finished their dinner remained seated instead of leaving. They looked at each other and quietly agreed to stay longer just to hear the rest of the performance. The young woman closed her eyes for a brief moment while playing. Her hands continued moving without hesitation. For someone watching closely, it almost looked like the piano itself was guiding her fingers. The melody turned into something more thoughtful now, slower and deeper. The sound carried a feeling of reflection, like someone remembering important moments from a long life. Every person in the restaurant felt it in a different way. Some heard hope in the music. Others felt a quiet sadness hidden between the notes. But everyone understood one thing. This was not ordinary music. The manager slowly walked closer to the piano bench, careful not to make noise. Standing only a few steps away now, the manager could see the woman's hands clearly. Her fingers moved with perfect control. Every note landed exactly where it needed to be. But what caught the manager's attention most was her expression. She was completely focused. There was no nervousness, no sign that she felt embarrassed about asking for food earlier. It was as if the moment she touched the piano, all of that disappeared. Here, at the piano, she belonged. At another table, a guest quietly spoke again. "Did you see how she walked in earlier?" the guest asked. "Yes," the friend replied. "She looked so tired." The friend nodded slowly. "And now look at her." They both watched silently for a moment. The contrast was striking. The woman who had entered the restaurant looking hungry and uncertain now looked confident and peaceful as she played. The music slowly began building again. Her fingers moved faster across the keys, creating a bright and energetic melody that filled the room with life. Several guests smiled without realizing it. The energy of the music was contagious. A waiter near the kitchen door whispered to one of the cooks, "This is the busiest the room has been all night, and no one is even eating." The cook chuckled quietly. "Who needs food when you have music like this?" Back at the piano, the young woman played a series of quick notes that sparkled across the keyboard like falling raindrops. A few guests softly clapped their hands against the table in appreciation, but quickly stopped, not wanting to break the flow of the music. Then came another change. The music slowed again, returning to a soft and emotional melody. This time the sound felt even deeper, almost like the final chapter of a long story. The woman's fingers moved more gently now. Each note was given time to breathe before the next arrived. The restaurant was so quiet that the faint sound of the piano keys themselves could be heard between the notes. The manager looked around the room. Every face was turned toward the piano. No one looked bored. No one looked distracted. They were all listening, and many of them were wondering the same thing. Who was this young woman? How had someone with such talent ended up walking into a restaurant asking for a simple meal? The music continued drifting through the air, touching every corner of the room. The woman leaned slightly closer to the piano as she played the final section of the piece. Her hands moved slower now, gentler. The melody softened into something peaceful and warm. Several guests held their breath, sensing that the end of the performance was approaching. The final notes were played quietly, like a soft goodbye. One last gentle chord filled the room. Then her hands slowly lifted from the keys. For a moment, complete silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire restaurant needed a second to return to reality after the music had ended. And then, suddenly, the room erupted into applause. The applause filled the restaurant so suddenly that it almost startled the young woman sitting at the piano. Only a moment earlier the room had been completely silent. Now the sound of clapping hands echoed from every corner. Some guests were even standing. The woman looked up slowly, clearly not expecting such a reaction. For a brief moment she seemed unsure of what to do. Her hands rested quietly in her lap while she looked around the room. Faces that had once been amused were now filled with admiration. A guest near the front table shook their head with a smile while clapping. "That was incredible," the guest said out loud. Another voice from across the room agreed. "Absolutely beautiful." The young woman gave a small, humble nod. She did not stand right away. Instead, she gently closed the piano lid halfway, as if finishing a quiet conversation with the instrument. The manager stepped forward first. The applause slowly softened as people realized the manager was approaching the piano. "That was remarkable," the manager said sincerely. The woman stood up slowly from the piano bench. Up close, she still looked tired, but there was now a calm confidence in her posture. "Thank you for allowing me to play," she said politely. Her voice was soft but steady. The manager shook their head slightly. "Allowing you?" the manager replied with a quiet smile. "You gave everyone here something special tonight." Several guests nodded in agreement. At one of the nearby tables, someone spoke up. "Yes, please play another one." A few others joined in with the same request. "Another song, please." The woman looked slightly surprised by the sudden enthusiasm. The manager raised a hand gently toward the guests. "Let's give her a moment," the manager said kindly. The guests laughed softly and returned to their seats, though their attention remained completely focused on the corner where the piano stood. The manager turned back to the woman. "You came in asking for food," the manager said. "That is the least we can offer you." The manager gestured toward a nearby table. "Please sit down. We'll bring you something warm." The woman looked grateful but also a little hesitant. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said quietly. "You're not causing trouble," the manager replied. "You've made this evening better for everyone." A waiter quickly prepared a small table near the window. Within a few minutes, a plate of warm soup, fresh bread, and a glass of water were placed in front of her. As she sat down, several guests continued watching her with curiosity and respect. The earlier laughter had completely disappeared from the room. In its place was a sense of admiration. The woman took a small sip of the soup. The warmth seemed to relax her slightly. At a nearby table, a guest leaned toward the manager again. "You should ask her where she learned to play like that," the guest suggested. The manager nodded thoughtfully and walked back toward the window table. "May I sit for a moment?" the manager asked politely. The woman looked up and nodded. "Of course." The manager pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The woman slowly finished a small piece of bread while the manager waited patiently. Finally, the manager asked gently, "Where did you learn to play like that?" The woman paused for a moment, thinking. "A long time ago," she said quietly. The answer sounded simple, but the way she said it carried something deeper. The manager leaned forward slightly. "You must have practiced for many years." She gave a small nod. "Yes." Another quiet pause followed. The guests nearby pretended not to listen, but it was obvious that many of them were curious about her story. The manager spoke again carefully. "If you don't mind me asking, what brought you here tonight?" The woman looked down at the table for a moment. Her fingers lightly touched the edge of the bowl. "Life changes in ways we don't expect," she said slowly. It was not a full explanation, but it was honest. The manager respected that and did not push further. Instead, the manager smiled gently. "Well, whatever your story is, your music speaks very clearly." The woman looked up and gave a small smile. "Music has always helped me when words were difficult." Across the restaurant, the cooks had finally returned to the kitchen, though one of them still glanced through the door occasionally. Guests had started eating again, but the energy in the room was different now. People spoke in softer voices. Every few minutes someone looked back toward the woman sitting near the window. After she finished her soup, The waiter brought a warm plate with a full meal. "You should eat more," the waiter said kindly. "You've earned it." She looked genuinely grateful. "Thank you." As she began eating, the manager returned to the counter. One of the regular guests walked over. "You know," the guest said quietly, "I've heard professional pianists who didn't play half as well as she did." The manager nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." The guest glanced toward the woman again. "What will you do now?" The manager folded their arms thoughtfully. "I'm not sure yet," the manager said, "but it would be a shame to let talent like that disappear." At the window table, the woman had nearly finished her meal. For the first time since she arrived, she looked relaxed. The warm food and the kindness in the room seemed to bring back a little of her energy. When she finished, she stood up slowly and walked back toward the piano. Several guests noticed immediately. One of them whispered excitedly, "She's going to play again." The manager looked up from the counter. The woman stopped beside the piano and spoke quietly. "I would like to thank everyone for your kindness tonight," she said. Her voice carried across the room just enough for people to hear. "And if it is all right, I would like to play one more piece." The answer came instantly. Applause, smiles, encouraging voices. "Yes, please do." The manager gave a warm nod. "The piano is yours." The woman sat down again at the bench. This time, the room grew quiet much faster than before. People knew now that something special was about to happen again. She rested her hands gently on the keys. But before playing, she paused for a moment. Her eyes moved slowly around the restaurant, at the faces watching her. The manager standing near the counter, the waiter by the kitchen door, the guests who had welcomed her with applause instead of judgment. A small smile appeared on her face. Then she turned back to the piano. Her fingers lowered to the keys once more, and the music began again. The room became quiet again the moment her fingers touched the keys. This time the silence felt different. Earlier, people had been curious. Now they were waiting with full attention, knowing that something beautiful was about to happen. The young woman pressed the first few notes softly, letting the sound spread slowly through the restaurant. It felt calm, like the beginning of a peaceful morning. Guests leaned back in their chairs and turned their full focus toward the piano. The melody grew gently, and her hands moved across the keyboard with the same natural confidence as before. But this time there was something even deeper in the music. The notes carried a feeling that was both warm and emotional. The manager stood near the counter, listening carefully. From the very first moment of the second performance, it was clear that this piece meant something personal to her. A guest sitting near the middle of the room whispered quietly to a friend, "This sounds different from the first one." The friend nodded. "It feels more personal." The woman's eyes stayed on the keys while she played. Her posture remained calm, but the music spoke loudly in its own quiet way. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong. A waiter slowly walked through the room carrying drinks but moved carefully so no noise would interrupt the music. Near the kitchen door, one of the cooks had stepped out again, unable to resist listening. "She started again?" the cook whispered. The waiter nodded with a small smile. "And somehow she sounds even better." The music grew richer as the woman's hands moved faster across the piano. Bright notes danced across the higher keys, while the deeper tones below supported the melody. The sound filled the entire room without feeling too loud. Guests watched her with expressions of admiration. One older guest closed their eyes again, letting the music wash over them like a gentle memory. At another table, two guests who had never met before earlier that evening were now quietly discussing the performance. "I can't believe she walked in asking for food," one of them said softly. "It just shows you," the other replied. "You never know someone's story." The melody shifted again, becoming softer and slower. The woman's fingers moved carefully now, almost like she was speaking through the piano. The manager noticed something else too. The way she played suggested years of experience. Every movement was precise, every note perfectly placed. This was not someone who had simply practiced as a hobby. This was someone who had once lived inside the world of music. At the window table where she had eaten earlier, a guest leaned forward. "I think she used to perform somewhere," the guest said quietly. "Maybe a concert hall," another person suggested. Across the room, the music grew stronger again. The woman leaned slightly forward as her fingers moved quickly across the keys. The melody turned lively, full of energy and life. Some guests began smiling as they listened. The joy in the music was impossible to ignore. The waiter who had welcomed her at the door earlier stood near the wall now, watching with quiet amazement. "I almost asked her to leave," the waiter whispered to another employee. The other worker chuckled softly. "Well, I'm glad you didn't." Back at the piano, the melody slowed again. This time the music felt thoughtful, like someone remembering a long journey filled with both good and difficult moments. The woman's face showed deep concentration. She was completely focused on the instrument, unaware of the many eyes watching her. One guest spoke quietly near the manager. "You should ask her to perform here regularly." The manager gave a thoughtful nod. "That thought has crossed my mind." The music continued flowing smoothly through the room. Outside the restaurant windows, the street remained dark and quiet. But inside, the warm lights and the sound of the piano created a peaceful world of their own. The woman began playing a gentle sequence of notes that sounded almost like falling rain. Each note landed softly before fading away. Guests sat completely still. No one wanted to break the moment. At one table, a young guest who had been restless earlier now sat quietly with wide eyes, watching the pianist with pure fascination. "Is she famous?" the young guest asked. The parent sitting beside them smiled softly. "I don't know," the parent said, "but she should be." The music began building toward its final section. The melody grew stronger and more powerful with each passing moment. Her hands moved quickly across the keyboard, creating a wave of sound that filled every corner of the restaurant. Guests leaned forward again, feeling the excitement rising in the music. The manager could see the emotion in her playing now. This piece clearly meant something to her. Felt like a message spoken through the piano. Then, just as the music reached its strongest point, she gently slowed it down again. The melody softened into a calm and peaceful ending. Her fingers moved slower now, pressing each note carefully as if she wanted the moment to last a little longer. The final part of the piece sounded warm and hopeful. One last gentle chord filled the air. Then the sound slowly faded away. Her hands lifted from the keys. For a brief second the restaurant was silent again. Then the applause returned, louder than before. Guests clapped enthusiastically. Some even stood from their chairs again. The woman looked slightly overwhelmed by the reaction. She stood up slowly from the piano bench and gave a small bow of appreciation. The manager stepped forward with a warm smile. "That was even more beautiful than the first one," the manager said sincerely. Guests nearby nodded and spoke their agreement. One guest called out with a friendly laugh, "Now you definitely owe her more than a meal." The room filled with light laughter and applause again. The woman smiled modestly but looked a little shy about the attention. The manager spoke gently. "You have given everyone here a night they won't forget." The woman lowered her eyes slightly. "I'm just grateful you let me play," she replied quietly. The manager looked thoughtful for a moment. Then the manager said something that made several guests lean closer to listen. "I think this restaurant could use a pianist like you." The woman looked up with quiet surprise. "Really?" The manager nodded slowly. "If you would like, we could talk about it." Guests around them began smiling even more, because suddenly it seemed that the young woman who had walked in asking for a simple piece of food might be leaving with something much more valuable. A new beginning. For a few seconds after the manager spoke, the young woman simply stood beside the piano without saying anything. The room was still filled with the soft sound of applause fading away, but now a different kind of silence settled in. It was the silence of curiosity. Many guests were watching her carefully. After all, only a short time ago she had walked through the door asking for a simple meal. Now the manager of the restaurant was offering her something much bigger. The woman looked at the piano for a moment before speaking. "You mean, playing here?" she asked quietly. The manager nodded. Yes, the manager said. If you are willing. Several guests at the nearby tables smiled as they listened. One person said softly, "That would be wonderful." Another guest added, "I would come back just to hear her play again." The woman seemed surprised by the support around her. She folded her hands together for a moment, thinking carefully. "I didn't expect anything like this tonight," she admitted. The manager leaned lightly against the piano. "Neither did we," the manager replied with a gentle laugh. A few people in the room chuckled quietly. The truth was obvious to everyone now. What had started as a simple request for food had turned into something special. The woman looked around the restaurant. The warm lights, the smiling faces, and the quiet kindness she had received all evening seemed to touch her deeply. She spoke slowly. "Music has always been the most important part of my life," she said. "But sometimes life becomes complicated." The manager listened without interrupting. "There were times when I thought I might never play again," she continued. Several guests exchanged thoughtful looks. It was clear that behind her calm voice there was a long story, one that she was not fully sharing. But no one needed to hear every detail to understand that she had faced difficult days. The manager nodded with quiet understanding. "Well," the manager said gently, "from what we heard tonight, the piano certainly hasn't forgotten you." That made the woman smile. A guest sitting near the window spoke up again. "You have a rare gift," the guest said sincerely. "You shouldn't hide it from the world." Another guest added, "You made this entire room feel something tonight." The woman seemed slightly shy about the compliments, but her eyes showed gratitude. She looked back at the manager. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked carefully. The manager spoke clearly so that she would understand. "This restaurant has had musicians before," the manager explained. "People come here not only for the food but also for the atmosphere." The manager gestured toward the piano. "But tonight felt different. The way people listened to you, it changed the whole room." Several guests nodded in agreement. "So," the manager continued, "if you are interested, we could arrange for you to play here regularly." The woman looked surprised again. "Regularly?" "Yes," the manager said. "Maybe a few evenings each week." She took a quiet breath, thinking. "I don't even know where I will be staying tomorrow," she admitted honestly. The manager paused for a moment, then smiled kindly. "Well," the manager said, "we can figure things out step by step." One of the waiters who had been listening nearby spoke up. "There's a small guest room upstairs," the waiter said. The manager looked toward the waiter, slightly surprised. "That's true," the manager said thoughtfully. The waiter shrugged. "It's empty most of the time." The manager turned back to the woman. "You could stay there for a few days," the manager offered. "At least until you decide what you want to do next." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "That's very generous," she said quietly. "You earned it tonight," the manager replied. Around the restaurant, guests were smiling warmly. One guest clapped lightly. "I think that's a wonderful idea." Another guest added, "This place just became the most interesting restaurant in the city." Soft laughter spread across the room again. The woman looked down for a moment, clearly moved by the kindness she was receiving. For someone who had walked in feeling hungry and uncertain, the evening had taken an unexpected turn. She finally looked up again. "If you truly don't mind, I would be grateful for the opportunity," she said. The manager extended a hand. Then it settled. She shook the manager's hand gently. The small agreement felt like the beginning of something new. Guests began clapping again, not loudly this time, but warmly. It felt less like applause for a performance and more like encouragement for a new chapter. The woman sat down again at the piano bench for a moment, resting her hands lightly on the instrument. She wasn't playing now, just sitting quietly. The manager spoke again. "Do you know something interesting?" the manager said with a small smile. "What?" she asked. "Earlier tonight," the manager explained, "some people laughed when you asked to play for food." The woman gave a soft laugh of her own. "Yes, I heard." The manager gestured toward the room. "But look at them now. Many of the same guests who had laughed earlier were now smiling with admiration. One of them raised a glass slightly and said, "We're glad you asked." The woman nodded warmly. "I'm glad too," she replied. The evening slowly returned to a normal rhythm after that. Guests finished their meals, waiters cleared tables, and quiet conversations resumed. But something about the atmosphere remained different. People continued glancing toward the piano from time to time, not because someone was playing, but because they remembered the music that had filled the room earlier. Later that night, after most of the guests had left, the restaurant became quiet again. The manager walked over to the piano one last time. The woman was still there, gently touching a few keys while thinking. "Quite a night," the manager said. She nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "A night I will never forget." The manager smiled. "Neither will we." Outside, the cold night continued as it had before. But inside the restaurant, something meaningful had happened. A hungry stranger had walked in asking for nothing more than a small piece of food. What she left with was much more than that. She left with respect, place to stay, and the chance to begin again with the one thing she had never truly lost: her music. And from that night forward, the small piano in the corner of the restaurant was never silent for long. Because sometimes, the most beautiful stories begin with the simplest question. "May I play for a piece of food?"